Let's talk about how the Great Plague of London shows us that slave voyages must be making up some of their data. The Great Plague of London lasted from 1665 to 1666. The official death count is 68,596 deaths within the city of London, but many scholars believe that thousands more died throughout the whole country. This is something that's really important to understand. I know we've all heard about the plague, but essentially this article gives us a little bit more background. Infections in all forms can be fatal unless treated immediately with antibiotics. And then we see that mortality rates can go anywhere from 1 to 15% for bubonic plague. And then in untreated victims, the rates are about 50% for bubonic plague and 100% for the other types of plague. Remember, we're talking about 1665. There were no antibiotics. If you're getting the pneumonic plague, you are definitely going to die. In fact, the plague was so bad that King Charles II issued this proclamation in 1665. The proclamation states that for the future, no ship or vessel whatsoever of or belonging to any His Majesty's subjects of his kingdom of England shall go or be permitted to set to sea out of or from any port or port of His Majesty's kingdom or any of the territories or dominions thereunto belonging to or for any parts or places beyond the seas. And this makes a lot of sense because researchers have now since discovered that at the minimum, 1 to 2% of all bubonic cases develop into the secondary pneumonic plague, which in turn may be transmitted from person to person through respiratory droplets. And we remember that that mortality rate is 100%. However, according to slave voyages, at least 27 ships left London, went to ports in West Africa, and then carried more than 3,000 slaves over to Barbados and Jamaica. I don't know if they just didn't hear the King's proclamation or they decided they didn't care or they're smugglers, but we're gonna just take them at their word. However, there is no historical evidence stating that the plague spread to West Africa or the colonies. So I was wondering, how could something so infectious like the plague spread violently in Europe to the point where other European nations were banning imports from England and the king himself banned all ships leaving, but yet it didn't affect any of the cargo, specifically the slaves coming from Africa or in the colonies? This question is pretty easy to figure out mathematically, given that we know quite a bit about how infectious diseases, especially the plague, spread among populations. First, I wanted to know, what is the probability that any of the ships are carrying infected persons when they're departing from London during the height of this great plague? So we know that there are 68,596 confirmed deaths. The population of London about this time is around 384,000. We know the mortality rate is around 33,000. And so you can calculate what the infection rate might have been based on how many have died. So we're looking at an infection rate of about 53.6%. Information about slave ships varies from site to site, but I'm just going to take a rough estimate. So from this site here, we have information that a ship could carry about 100 persons for a crew and then about 700 enslaved people. So I'm going to use those numbers. Then let's say, what is the probability that at least one person on a ship, on any of those 27 ships, were infected? Essentially, the probability of all 800 people being uninfected is so low, there's effectively a 100% chance that at least one person has the plague on at least one ship. So then let's carry that forward and calculate what the probability could have been for all 27 ships. And essentially we arrive with a number that is so low that it's impossible. So the probability that all 27 ships leaving London had at least one infected person is also 100%. So again, just to summarize what's going on, given the historically documented death toll numbers and then what we know about the spread of the plague based on current research in infectious diseases, the probability that every single ship that is documented on slave voyages, at least one person infected with the plague, is 100%. There is no way to escape that. So given what we know about what was happening with the shipping and the spread of the plague, we could say that during these voyages, during the first 30 days, you'd probably see about 50 to 100 cases start to emerge. So by day 30, you're looking at about 30 people dead, with about 50 to 60% of people infected. Here's the important part. We know from the literature that 1 to 5% of bubonic cases convert into the secondary pneumonic plague, which is the one with a 100% mortality rate. So even if you looked at a midpoint of a 3% conversion rate, you're going to have 2 to 3 people of those cases develop the pneumonic plague. Once they become pneumonic, or they have that secondary plague, there's a 100% mortality rate. The reason it's so deadly is because it is the type of plague that spreads person to person. So if you're imagining in the slave quarters or even on a ship, there's no escape. People are breathing the same air, they're coughing, they're sneezing, they're getting sick. So the transmission is going to be continuous and unavoidable person to person. That means by the end of 3 months at sea, with no escape, nowhere to go, in extremely close quarters, you are going to have pretty much probably 100% of your crew, the people you are carrying, dead. So if every ship had to have carried the plague, the pneumonic conversion is a mathematical certainty. Once a plague emerges, you have total mortality inevitable. In order for those voyages that are listed on slave voyages to be accurate, that means 27 ships would have had to explicitly defy the King of England and find a way to leave closed ports. They would have had to survive from people who are likely infected, get to Africa without anyone getting sick and dying. They would have had to pick up slaves in Africa without spreading the plague anywhere at any port. Then they would have had to travel 2 to 3 months with those slaves and their infections all the way to Barbados, also not dying, not spreading the infection, and then make it to Barbados. Those slaves would then go to Barbados, not spread the plague, and no one died. In 2009, this article talks about how the plague had been modeled by different governments to be used as a biological weapon. Very specifically here, we can understand that models of this particular use talked about the intentional release of about 50 kilos of the plague in the air in a city of about 5 million people. How many deaths that would occur from that. But the more important part is, if you read down there, an outbreak of the pneumonic plague involving 50% of a population could result in infection of 90% of the rest of the population in 20 to 30 days and could cause fatality ratio of 60 to 70%. So remember, this is in a city where people can go to their homes, they can isolate themselves. So if you're seeing a 60 to 70% mortality rate in a city with plague just being dropped from the air, how is it that we're supposed to believe slaves and crew on ships in very, very close quarters for 3 months somehow remained untouched and uninfected when they are leaving from ports in London? They can't explain it because those voyages never happened.